Thank you all very much indeed for joining our second session for SH Leadership Week. Some of you I know recognizing some of the names from the participant list joined yesterday's session. It's great to see you back for this one. I'm Tim McEwen, for those of you who are joining us anew, and I'm the Managing Director of SH Leadership. As I said, some of you will have joined our session yesterday, but yesterday I ran, for the benefit of those that are new to the group, I ran a brief session which outlined really what SX Leadership is all about. But also we had a bit of a discussion towards the back end of that around what are people expecting or experiencing in terms of coming back to the world of work post-COVID, what are they planning, and what are the implications that people are thinking it might have for our leadership and for our culture. Today, we are going to hear in presentation style from Roderic Yapp. Rod is our lead consultant in our leadership practice, and Rod is going to share with us some thoughts and ideas around this whole notion of the balanced leader, and I'm going to allow Rod to expand more around what that means, and he'll also give it a chance to introduce himself. As we all know, we've all got used to Zoom and remote protocols. So if we could keep our microphones on mute, that would be terrific. Thank you very much indeed. I think for the purposes of this presentation, we will hold questions till the end of it, if that's all right. But please do feel free to add a question at any point in the chat, and that way we can come to them. And we've got a question off the bat when we get to that point at the end. Additionally, Neha will put into the chat a link to all the up and coming sessions so that we know what else we've got lined up for the rest of the week if you wish to join any of them. And other than that, I have nothing else to say, and hand you over to Rod and say enjoy the session, and I look forward to a great conversation at the end of it. Over to you, Rod.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. If you can just give me a thumbs up to show that you can actually hear me. Happy with that. Good to go.
Good.
So, good afternoon. My name is Roderic Yapp, and I'm going to share really a few thoughts on how I think about leadership. To give you a bit of context, I've been studying leadership in a variety of different environments for perhaps the last 20 years, starting off with an interest in it when it came to water polo, the sport I played at university, building on it with my first career as an officer in the Royal Marines. I served in the Corps from 2005 to 2012. I served in Afghanistan. I evacuated civilians from Libya in 2011 when the Gaddafi Spring, when the Arab Spring kicked off and the Gaddafi regime collapsed. And then towards the end of my career, I specialized in counter-piracy. So I did a sort of number of different things during my time in the military, largely sort of leading teams of people in difficult places. I built on this experience by leaving the Corps in 2012 to join a company called Urenco, who enrich uranium as part of the nuclear fuel cycle. And there I worked with leaders who'd been promoted because they were technically competent and now had to lead a team. And so I supported them through that. And really, I've kind of built on my experience from my time in the Marines, from my time in the military, and also from my time in the nuclear industry and working with a number of professional sports teams to sort of develop my thinking around leadership, what it means and sort of what it is. But for this, I want to start with really a bit of a story. Comes from my time in Afghanistan and perhaps helps you or helps me communicate what I think good leadership looks like. So I serve in a place called Sangin in the middle of Helmand province. Sangin is the largest town in Helmand. It effectively is about halfway up the Helmand Valley on the edge of an area called the Green Zone, which you can see in this sort of picture behind you. On this particular day, we went out on a company patrol. This was sort of back in 2007. To give you a bit of a sense of sort of how many people there are in a company, we're talking about 120 Marines. We went out for about 13 hours out on the ground, which means we left before first light. We traveled down south through the Green Zone, and then we punched out into the desert and sort of came around through the east and then back into the sort of Sangin district centre. And this is a picture of my radio operator with his large antenna on. We're moving out of the green zone, out through the sort of the compounds and out into the sort of desert area before we sort of come back in. And this is how we would patrol. It's about 35 degrees in terms of temperature there. It's very hot, it's extremely dusty, it's an arid environment, and it's very, very demanding on kit, equipment, and personnel. So we're coming back into our district centre. And so I said, as I said, we were going to move out into the sort of desert area, which is out towards the east, and come back in from the north. And to orientate you to the ground, Sangin District Centre, the patrol base that we operated out of, is the light green area that you can see to the top left of this slide. And as we were coming back in through the fields to the north, I found myself in this field here, which I have highlighted in darker green. And as we were coming back into the base, the Taliban, who'd been watching us out on patrol, knew that the base was lightly defended, and they attacked it with everything they had. And so there were a number of sort of firing points that were engaging the Sangin District Centre. It was a pretty impressive weight of fire, to say the least. And at this point here, I'm in this field and I sort of duck down. Now, the way it used to work on the ground in Afghanistan was that we would have Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police working alongside us. And they were mentored by British Army counterparts. And what that basically means is that they made them stand next to them and they said, what I shoot at, you shoot at. And hopefully, we will start to sort of upskill you and train you and develop you by sort of kind of osmosis as much as anything. So these Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police are meant to work with the British Army. Now, when I say army and police, you probably think of a British soldier and you probably think of a British police officer on the streets that you might see in London. They're not really like that. Whilst they may be called the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police, they're more like a state-sponsored gang. So they look like the locals, they are taken from the local population, but they don't particularly like wearing a uniform. And they don't like particularly being told what to do. So it's quite a challenging group of stakeholders, to say the least. So the Taliban attacked the base, and they managed to hit someone very early on, an Afghan National Army soldier, I think, who was standing on sentry. And the Afghan National Army basically picked up their rifles and they proceeded to head out into the bazaar and shoot at everything, okay? And so I'm in this field down here, and the sort of, you know, at the kind of southern edge, there's a sort of wall there, which is roughly the height of my waist. And I'm ducking down below it, trying to work out what's going on. Where's the Taliban? Where's the ANA? Where are the British Army, who are trying to sort of keep up with these, frankly, Afghan army soldiers who were crashing out into this bazaar? And it was an incredibly confusing picture. To give you a sense of sort of what's going on, the rounds are splashing into the field next to me. Someone is shooting at us, but I can't sort of work out who. And my world is sort of gradually getting smaller and smaller in this sort of incredibly confusing picture. To give you a sense of how confusing it was, my troop sergeant turned and started shooting at the Afghan National Police detachment that had been patrolling with us for the last 13 hours. Unfortunately, he was a rubbish shot and he managed to miss them from 30 yards. But that gives you an indication as to how confusing it was. And at this point in time, I can't work out where the enemy are. I can't work out really what's going on. But I know that they're going to try and get round the side. They're going to try and use some form of cover, and they're ultimately going to try and come and get us, which is what they're trying to do. And so in order to get out of this situation, I said, right, this is what we're going to do. We're all going to break cover at the same time, and we're going to return fire at anything that is shooting at us. Now, what this requires is for you and the other people around you all to have extremely high levels of trust. Because when I mean breaking cover, I mean everyone is going to stand up at the same time. We're going to present 15 to 20 targets. So we're going to ultimately, hopefully, buy ourselves half a second of time to return fire and get them to put their heads down. That's really what I'm trying to achieve. But you can imagine, if I'm the only one that puts my head up, I'm one target, I'm going to draw all the fire in my direction. It's not going to work very well. And so I counted it down on the radio on what must have been the longest sort of 5 or 6 seconds of my life. And at that moment, as I counted down to 0, we all broke cover and we started to engage the shooting positions that were engaging us. And after a while, we'd sort of won the firefight, we returned enough fire, they were starting to duck down and sort of move out of the area. There'd been another casualty taken in Helmand, so that the medical teams had gone to there, which meant that instead of going after them, we were actually pulled back into the base. And I remember as we sort of came back into the base, I looked over my shoulder and I saw on a sort of piece of higher ground, someone pull what was effectively a casualty, a dead body, back behind sort of cover. And at this point, I'd been in Afghanistan for probably 3 months and I'd never seen the Taliban. So I started to think, you know, there's a good chance here in this very confusing situation. We've had what's called a blue on green, which means as British Marines, as British servicemen, we have killed an Afghan National Army soldier or policeman, which is obviously not something we want to happen. And as I was sort of coming back into the base, I was starting to replay this in my head. What did I do? What could I have done? I came in, we unload the weapons, and I go to speak to the company second in command and sort of say, look, this is what's happened. I think we've had a blue on green. And I relayed the story to him very much in the same terms as I've sort of relayed it to you. And he said to me, look, you made a decision under pressure. We didn't get the outcome that we wanted, but ultimately we can't always sort of control that. We'll have a bit of a process to follow because we need to sort of write up kind of what happened while it's all fresh in our minds. But ultimately, you did the best you could in very difficult circumstances. Go and pass that on to the lads, get the weapons cleaned, get the radio batteries recharged, go through your post-battle procedure, and we'll start again tomorrow. And I remember walking away from that feeling, frankly, incredibly supported and sort of looked after. There was always going to be an investigation when something like this happens. We investigate to check what were the facts, we write it all up, and we go through a bit of a process. But his response didn't make me feel like I was going to get in any sort of trouble. I'd made the decision under fire. No decision made under pressure is perfect. And I felt that he recognized that and he understood it. Now, that for me is a really good example of what good leadership looks like. Leaders show themselves when the chips are down. Leadership, frankly, is easy when everything is going well. When mistakes are being made, when decisions are being made under pressure, leaders show themselves by supporting the people around them. Now, if you contrast that with what he could have said, which is, there's going to be some form of investigation, Rod. I don't know how that's going to go. All of those things, factually accurate, would have had an impact on me. And I would have had an impact on my Marines. And that impact may have meant that the next time they were required to open fire, that they would have been hesitant. And in this environment, hesitancy gets you killed very, very quickly. So for me, this is a really good example of what leadership looks like. And ultimately, this is the kind of first point I want to make, right? Leadership is all about behavior. It's how you behave given a set of circumstances. It's how you act and how you make people feel in a given moment. There are lots of definitions for leadership. I would offer this one. Ultimately, it's all about behavior. But behavior is dependent upon context, and that's what makes it so difficult. We know this because how you might behave on a stag or hen do will be different to how you behave at a funeral, right? Because the context is very, very different. And I think leadership is affected by that as well. And so whilst I may direct you to some articles on LinkedIn that will say, you know, leadership is all about empowering people. It's all about pushing decision-making down to the lowest level and letting people get on with it. I would say, yes, 9 times out of 10, I agree with that in very specific circumstances. I mean, my job in the Marines was to empower Marines to know when to pull the trigger. And that's a very difficult thing to do, often when you're dealing with some quite young lads who are about sort of 18 years old. And that's an incredible decision that you are inviting them to take. But you have to teach them how to do it based on sort of judgment. Judgment is based on kind of context. So yes, I believe in empowerment, but it has to be specific to the context. This is easy to kind of demonstrate. Because if I was meeting you outside Gresham Street, we're about to go into the office at Sheffield House in the centre of London. And as we were turning away to go and open the door, we see a car come round the corner a little bit too fast, catch the edge of the curb, and flip over onto its roof, right? If good leadership is all about empowering people, the most appropriate way of behaving would be turning to the people next to me and going, do you think we should call the ambulance? Or should we call the police? Or what do you think we should do, all right? But you can see very quickly how in that example, that behavior doesn't fit the context. This is a situation where someone is probably hurt. They're certainly going to be scared and worried. You need to get over there. You need to make some decisions based on what you find in that car. So if someone is hurt, you're going to need to call the ambulance and so on and so forth. This is not a good time to empower people. In fact, empowering people in this instance might make them really stressed and really nervous and really unhappy. And this is the point I want to offer, okay? In order to act in the right way in this situation, you may want to choose to be very decisive, hold a very tight level of sort of command and control. Is that appropriate for every situation? Probably not. Well, definitely not. But in this situation, it is. And this relates to how you lead your teams as well. Understanding this context, this variable that changes all the time. So if you take over a team and frankly, their performance is pretty poor, okay? There could be a number of reasons for that. But one of the first things you'll want to work out is, right, how do I change the performance of this organization? How do I take this group of people and how do I get them to focus on the things that matter, that are ultimately going to make the line go up, whatever that line is. You might take over a team or a group of people or even an organization where the morale is really, really low. Could be for a number of reasons. Could be because the predecessor was a bit of a bully or very abrasive, or because they were driven too hard to achieve the organization's aims. A variety of different things. Lastly, for those of you that work in regulated industries, you might have taken over an organization or a team where there's been some sort of fraud or deception or some sort of really bad behavior. And the regulator needs some sort of management because they're a stakeholder, frankly, that doesn't trust you. Now, all of these are examples of context that might be different, might be different in any organization you take over. There could be one of these issues, there could be all three of them. But in order to understand that, you need to understand that, the context that came before you, and then choose your behavior in order to get the best out of the team, the situation, all right? And my second point, so leadership is all about behavior. Behavior is based on context. This is why I think you need to be really wary of simplistic definitions, okay? So for those of you who play golf out there, myself included, not very well, might I add, a simple definition for leadership is like having one golf club in the bag, right? It's like having the driver. That works really well when you've got a long way to go in certain situations. But in many situations, it won't work well at all, okay? So what I would invite you to do as leaders is think about what are the different tools that I have at my disposal? What are the different ways of thinking and acting? And how do I choose the best way of behaving in order to match the context? Because the context of the golf course changes all the time, whether it's the green, the bunker, the rough, or the tee, okay? And you have different tools to use in different situations. And I think in order to get the best out of people, that's not a bad way of thinking about it. So leadership is all about behavior. Behavior is dependent on context. That's what makes it so difficult, okay? Because the context changes all the time, right? This is why we check in with people when we first interact with them, okay? We ask them, right, how are you? How are things going? And if someone responds to you and goes, yeah, I'm fine, and you can read and you go, that individual's not fine, okay? You get that intuitive gut reaction. That's the moment where you might want to go, you sure? You sure everything's okay? Maybe that individual then turns around and says, look, I know we were meant to have a conversation in relation to my career or this objective or this action, but my dog was killed this morning and I'm not really feeling it at the moment. I'm not really focused on that, okay? That's a really good example of where the context has suddenly changed based on something that someone has just shared with you, right? And how you adjust to that will dictate whether or not that individual wants to work for you and is inspired by you or doesn't. Now, depending on that sort of situation, there are a variety of different things that you can do. The point I want to make here is that that's an example of the context being changed and you may be needing to adjust your approach slightly, all right? Again, that's what makes it so hard. That context piece is changing all the time. People are watching you all the time as well. They are watching to see what you do and how you act, because that says more about what you value than what you say. So to use an example of my experience in the Royal Marines, the commando tests, which are something that all Marines have to pass in order to be commando qualified, officers have to do all of the tests at a faster time than the lads. And the reason being is because they want to set us up for success. They want to bake in that kind of high performance. And it's all built around the ethos of you have to earn your rank. You have to earn the opportunity to lead these guys, which means that you have to be able to not outperform all of them, but the bar for you, the expectation is higher. If I was to look at an example from sport, use Johnny Wilkinson or David Beckham, I'm showing my age here, but high performers who inspired other people to improve themselves and to get better. These are the type of people that would stay behind after practice to practice kicking or free kicks, right? They work extra hard and they inspire people by their behavior more than what they say. That is part of it, but ultimately it's the behavior. Now, to bring this back to the kind of workplace for us, that's all about how do we respond when mistakes get made? Do we turn up on time for meetings or are we consistently 5 or 10 minutes late, okay? Like, how do we communicate verbally? How do we communicate via email? Do we do it with empathy? All of these kind of things. And again, that's what makes it so difficult, right? Because the eyes are on you the whole time when you're in a leadership role. So what I'd like you to do, and I'm not going to ask you to do this now, but after this after this brief webinar, I'd like you to think of someone that has inspired you, okay? Think of an individual who has inspired you over the course of your career. It might be someone that inspired you as you were growing up, might be a parent, might be a family member, might be a role model, whoever that is, all right? Almost certainly, if I ask you to think about that individual, you'll remember what they did, how they behaved, and how it made you feel. And more often than not, and I've done this exercise so many times now, it's when people are in their moment of greatest weakness and heightened vulnerability, that's when they are extra sensitive to the people around them. So for example, if we use the example that I have just used, if someone shares with you that their dog has just died or a family member is sick or that one of their parents has just died or something like that, okay, and you respond empathetically and say, look, what do you need? How do I provide you with the space that you need right now? Give me the answers, tell me what to do. You will probably get huge amounts back from that individual in the future because you were there for them when they needed you. And fundamentally, that's how relationships work, okay? And that's really what we're talking about here. So you remember what they did, how they behaved, and how they made you feel. And that's why leadership is about behavior. And of course, behavior is shaped by context. Now, in order to kind of take it further than that, I mean, I have really just set the context there. I want to offer you a couple of things, and I've broken them out into sort of 2 different areas. The first are a series of foundations, and then a kind of series of spectrums, which I'm going to go through in turn. The foundations really are things that you cannot afford not to do, okay? These are the non-negotiables that you have to always be conscious of and always be working on. And the spectrums are slightly different because depending on the context, one way of behaving might be right, another way of behaving might be right, okay? And so I'd invite you to think about your behavior in relation to the spectrums and where you naturally sit on that. I'll come to that in a second. So the first foundation is self-awareness. I've talked a little bit about understanding the context, creating clarity, being decisive, 2-way accountability. So you hold people to account, but also they hold you to account. And lastly, strong relationships. These are the spectrums on the right-hand side. And I'm going to go through all this in a bit more detail in a second. That's going to be the sort of meat of this presentation here. So I'll move on. The first one, or the first foundation I want to talk about, is this concept of self-awareness. Now, the more I've studied about leadership, the more I believe that self-awareness is the foundation upon which everything else sits, okay? And the reason is because leaders are trying to have an impact. They're trying to influence people. They're trying to make things happen, all right? But without self-awareness, it's very difficult to match your intent, what you want to happen, with your impact, okay? Self-awareness is about understanding how people are actually reacting to you. What impact are you having? And I've used this kind of example before from my military background, obviously, but when you're shooting on the range, okay, and you're missing the target because your sight is misaligned or you're using someone else's rifle that isn't set up for you, okay? You're missing the target, right? You have no idea what sort of impact you're having. And the reality is that if you're not checking in regularly with your team members and with your stakeholders to say, you know, how am I doing? Am I helping you perform better, or am I getting in the way? You've got no sense of what sort of impact you're having. And that's a bit like shooting at the target and missing. And in order to get impact, in order to understand where you're hitting, that's why you need to shoot the ground, okay? If you're missing the target, shoot the deck, kick up some dust, work out what's going on, generate that feedback loop and adjust accordingly. And that intent and impact thing is really important. I use that language all the time, because if you say, look, this is what I'm trying to achieve, if my intent was out, please tell me, all right? So in this presentation here, here's a good example. I'm trying to share some ideas with you. And if you guys have any feedback for me that can help me get this across better, then please share them with Tim. Please share them with the Sheffield Haworth contacts that invited you to this. The reason being is because that helps me get the impact right, helps me hit what I want to hit, which ultimately is what it's all about. That helps me improve by giving me that feedback loop, okay? So without self-awareness, you can't match your intent with your impact. I've talked a little bit about the second point here, which is all about understanding the context. And I've changed this slightly because your leadership context is not something that is set, right? If a team member of yours says, you know, my dog's died this morning, that's a really good example of how the context for that individual has changed. And you need to do something differently as well. You can't just go, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but today this is what we're going to talk about here in this team meeting. I want to understand why your performance is where it needs to be, okay? You can imagine how that individual is going to feel, right? So leadership context is something that changes all the time. But these are some things that I'd invite you to ask yourself. So what's the current situation? What happened before I arrived, right? What did this organization or this team look like before I got here, right? What have I been told to do? What's the direction that my senior leadership or the board have asked me to do? Where are we going? Is that clear? Is it well understood? Can I look at every team in this organization or every individual in my team and be clear that they are working on stuff that makes this direction happen? Or not, okay? Or maybe there's somewhere in between. That's another example of your leadership context, all right? What are my resources and boundaries, okay? Where are the limits of my control? Where are there frictions between team members and departments? What is the stuff that kind of needs to be sorted out? All of this, part of your context. And lastly, who are my stakeholders and what is important to them, all right? They could be your peers, they could be the people that you report to or work for, they could be your team members, they could be other parts of the business, but understanding what's important to them and how I can support them to achieve it and vice versa is a really healthy kind of conversation. Those are just some things to think about in relation to your context, all right? And you can see how that changes day to day. It changes with every organization. It changes in every single role that you do. The third point I want to make, or the third fundamental, I think, third foundation, is this concept around creating clarity. And these are some questions that I'd invite you to sort of think about. But firstly, like, what's the end state that we're working towards, right? Where do you as an organization want to go or want to be in 5 years, 10 years? And how confident are we that everyone is working towards that singular end state? Who do we serve as an organization, right? Who's our niche? Again, that question depends on whether you're asking it as a group of people or as you as an individual or as you as a team. And why are we doing this? How does this contribute towards making the world a better place on some level, okay? These are some questions to reflect on. If you can get answers to these, you will create clarity, okay? Or you will move in the direction of creating a form of clarity. I was listening to a podcast with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, the High Performance podcast, I think this was a week or so ago. And he said a line that really sort of stuck with me. Ambiguity is the enemy of high performance. And I think he's absolutely true. And he talked about it in relation to football. So when you're about to send a substitute onto the pitch, don't give them 3 things to think about because you'll confuse them. Give them 1 thing to focus on. Make sure they are absolutely clear on what it is they have to do. So it could be something as simple as, that playmaker is killing us. I want you to be so close to him that no one passes him the ball for the next 90 minutes. That's all I want you to do, okay? That's a really good example of clarity. And that's just an example sort of from the world of sport, but it is equally applicable. because if you don't create clarity, it's very difficult for people to make decisions and they get confused easily. Being decisive is the fourth one. Leaders make decisions. They go, right, what's the information we need in order to make this decision? Because decisions create clarity in the organization. It helps set people up for success. The two examples of organizations that I think of when I think about sort of decisiveness are probably Amazon, because they focused they maintained a laser-like focus on disrupting the books market before they moved on to everything else. And this is the thing, right? Being decisive is about being really clear on what we're going to work on so that we can dedicate all our energy in a singular direction. The word priority was never meant to be pluralized into having priorities, because if I ask you to do 5 things, you're splitting your effort and attention across all of them. And I think it's better to have really difficult conversations and decide what are we not going to do before we can work out what we are going to do. What are all the things that people have got on their plate that are wasting their time, that are not helping us achieve our vision and our direction? This is where clarity starts to overlap. But this is a really interesting question to ask people. What are you not going to do? What is the stuff that you need to take out so that you can double down and really, really focus on one area? This concept of being decisive is really important. The fifth one is about two-way accountability. So creating a culture where people are comfortable holding each other to account, all right? Where they're happy having those really blunt and direct conversations and and they're very comfortable having a differing set of opinions and views, all right? But they're still willing to kind of move forward and hold each other to account with what they said they were going to do. Too often, I found leaders have an expectation that they hold their people to account, but they are less comfortable with their team members holding them to account. One of the ways I've seen this done really well is when people say, or when great leaders have said, right, these are the things that I expect of you. And in return, you can expect these things from me. So I will make decisions. I will maintain a culture of absolute clarity, okay? If I'm not doing that, tell me, okay? I hold you to account, you hold me to account. The thing about accountability is if it doesn't exist in an organization, it feels like lots is going on, but you're not actually making any forward progress. And I've worked in organizations that lack accountability. Lots and lots of meetings, lots of energy, lots of people talking a really, really good game. The wheels are spinning, but we aren't going forward because nothing is actually getting done. People are not holding to each other to account for a level of performance. The next one is kind of obvious, and I don't really want to spend a huge amount of time on it, but strong relationships based on trust, okay? Now, there's a partnership element to this as well. So it's not just about leaders maintaining that relationship. It's about members in their team being trustworthy. It's about being a good follower as well as being a good leader. Strong relationships based on trust are really, really important, okay? Most people that work in the executive search sector know this really, really well. But do you build relationships within the firm as well as you build relationships with people outside of the organization? It's just a challenge. I don't know. It's just a question to ask. But all of the best things in life tend to come from really, really strong relationships based on mutual respect and trust, okay? So take time to get to know each other. Take time to have those conversations where you don't talk about work, you just talk about what people have got going on in their lives. It's really, really important, okay? The small talk is the important stuff, ultimately. Now, those are sort of 6 foundations, and I think of them as foundations because if you don't have those, the stuff that I'm going to talk about next isn't really going to be helpful. And in fact, actually, if most leaders just focused on those 6, they'd probably be pretty good, right? But this is a concept that I think hopefully you won't have come across before, but this is something that both Tim and myself have been working on for a number of years now. And this is a concept called the foundations, called the spectrums, all right? We've already talked about leadership being about behavior, but behavior being shaped by context. And there are examples of this in the news all the time of where people get this wrong. So some of you would have seen the quite shocking footage of the US Army lieutenant in this picture here, being pepper sprayed because he wasn't complying with this police officer and getting out of the car. Now, this was for a really minor traffic infringement, all right? But this is one of the problems with sort of policing in the US, is that they struggle to be able to adjust and adapt to the context, which is why we get incidences like this, all right? Was that the right thing to do? Probably not with hindsight, okay? But it's not necessarily his fault. There's a number of things that can kind of contribute towards that, poor training, all sorts of things. So I don't seek to blame anyone for this. But the outcome of this has been, unfortunately, the police officer has lost his job. So I would argue that was it a good outcome for him? Probably not. So leadership's about behaviour. Behaviour is about adapting to the context. And so what I'd like to share with you is this concept of balance, really, okay? Now, I've already used the car crash example as one whereby you don't want to devolve responsibility in that moment in time. Actually, you want someone who goes, right, this is what we're going to do. You call the ambulance, you call the fire brigade because this person's going to need to be cut out of that car. You call the police because they need to be involved. You're not doing anything. Go and speak to that person who's clearly traumatized. Ask them about their day. Just make small talk with them. Get them to think about something else other than what they've just seen, okay? And in that environment, having a really tight command and control style of leadership is entirely appropriate, okay? In other environments, you may not want to behave like that. Now, that's a spectrum, right? That's a spectrum of control, if you like. And where I've put a little dot here, that actually represents myself. So naturally, I'm a bit of a control freak. I won't even delegate slides to someone else to work on because I like to have full control over absolutely kind of everything, right? Now that's fine. I can accept myself as that. What is key is that I'm able to adjust myself to the context. I'll come on to that in a second. Sometimes it's really important to demonstrate confidence, right? Confidence that you know what you're doing and that things are going to be okay. In the car crash example, that is a requirement for a high level of confidence. When my daughter was born, gosh, 2013, my wife had to go in for sort of an emergency cesarean. And I was really, really nervous at the time because there were lots of machines making lots of funny noises. And I was in there clueless, no idea what was going on. And I approached someone who was clearly a surgeon, or I assumed to be a surgeon, and said, can you just reassure me and tell me everything is okay? And his response was borderline arrogant, definitely confident. He said to me, listen, mate, that bleeping is the baby's heart rate. If that starts to tail off, I'll have that baby out of your wife in about 15 seconds. And I suddenly felt, oh, well, what was I worrying about? And it's a really good example of where I was reassured by a highly confidential, borderline arrogant individual, but I was massively appreciated by that. The last thing I wanted him to demonstrate was any form of humility in that environment. Leaders have to balance this combination of being highly challenging and highly supportive. So you should be looking to push members of your team and help them fulfill their potential. But equally, you're not going to do that by being a hard taskmaster. You need to be supportive of them. You need to support them in terms of helping them develop, helping them see what you're trying to do. So you can have some fairly difficult conversations with people, provided you say, look, you know, the context of this conversation is my expectations. I think you have a lot of potential. And my job over the next 2 to 3 years of us working together is to get the very best out of you. So I'm going to be very direct with you. I'm going to push you hard. You up for that? That's both highly challenging and highly supportive, okay? And tends to go down reasonably well in my experience. So on the one hand, we've got standards and process, something I'm very comfortable with. I like a good standard. I mean, you can see from my office here, okay, I like to lay things out neatly. I like to find the best way of doing things. By my nature, I'm not a creative and innovative person. This is my own personal belief. Some people need a good level of standards and sometimes sort of think about how things are going. Others, much, much less so. And they tend to be more creative and innovative. Like, it doesn't matter where you are in that spectrum, provided you can appreciate people who sit on the other end of that spectrum and recognize where you are strong and they are strong. That's ultimately what a strong team looks like. You need to have a combination of being able to see the big picture So where are we going in 5 years' time? What's this organization going to look like? What's this team going to look like? Where am I trying to take us? Okay. But equally, you need to have an understanding of the detail, right? You need to know what's going on. Otherwise, you will create the conditions for people to, frankly, go rogue and work on whatever it is they want to. You can't afford to be too much on one end of that spectrum or the other. And lastly, and this was probably the last one that we really kind of discovered, most of the time you want leaders who are empathetic, okay? But there are certain situations where you need people who can take an element of emotion out of the equation. So the classic example is, you know, the ship is sinking and, you know, it's a warship that's being torpedoed, and the guys need to close the hatch and sort of, you know, secure it off to keep the ship afloat. And there are people in there who are going to die, right? That's a really unusual situation that requires an individual to be callous to save the lives of many people. But equally, if you're leading an organization of 100,000 people that goes through some form of massive disaster, and you need to make 20,000 people redundant to save the jobs of 80,000, if you are too empathetic, you will really struggle to do that. And I've actually seen very senior leaders lose their jobs off the back of the fact that they cannot move down that spectrum. They cannot be callous, and they cannot go, in order to save the organization, I'm going to sacrifice some people. And it's a horrible thing to do. But that is the last end of the spectrum, or the last spectrum that I'd like to share with you and get you to think about. Now, how it works, right, is as follows. So we've got our spectrum: centralized control on one side, devolved responsibility on the other. Both can be right and both can be wrong. But as I've said all along, it's all about the context. So good leaders are able to understand the context at any given moment, right? How am I required to behave? But because they're self-aware, they understand their natural way of behaving. So how do I usually act in these circumstances? And if you know how you usually act, you can make a choice. All behavior is a choice. No one has any buttons that can be pressed, okay? You can choose to behave in a certain way. It takes practice. It's not easy, but it can be done, okay? So how should I behave to match the context and get the best out of the situation? So if the context requires me to devolve responsibility, so let's say you take over a team of experienced sales professionals, right? They know what they're doing. They just need a sort of target and some support to kind of get there, right? So this is a group of experienced sales professionals who are invited, who are keen to be empowered, right? That's the context that you face. But if you're a bit like me and you have a naturally sort of high level of control, your natural instinct might be to go, well, I'm going to sort of get into their detail. I'm going to get into the weeds. I'm going to micromanage them. And actually, that's really, really inappropriate, okay? But if you can understand your natural way of behaving and choose to empower them, because that's what the context requires, then it's likely to go down well, okay? So context, understand it, understand your natural way of behaving, and either adopt that or move away from it, all right? Choose your behavior. That's the key thing to match the context. Because if you don't, so if you fail to understand the context, or if you fail to take into account your natural way of behaving, you'll just behave however, you'll just behave based on your natural way of doing things, how you've always done things, and you'll possibly miss the mark, okay? And there are lots and lots of leaders out there that, instead of getting the very best out of their people, actually achieve almost the exact opposite. And often it comes down to the fact that the individual wants to be empowered. They know what they're doing. They want to be sort of left alone. Give me a clear goal. I'll work towards it, right? But the leader, to use this instance, could be a really tactical micromanager that's just getting in the way. So it's 13:46 now. What I'd invite you to do after this, and I'm very happy to kind of share these slides, is get you to reflect, right, where do I sit on this spectrum, okay? Where do I sit? Am I someone that likes a high level of control, or am I much more comfortable with devolving responsibility? And the key with this is that you can have a perception, you have a view, but actually what I'd invite you to do if you're brave enough, is ask your people, where am I on this spectrum? If you didn't know me, would you say that I'm a bit of a control freak, or would you say I'm pretty comfortable with devolved responsibility and giving you the keys to kind of get on with things? Ask why they say that, all right? Encourage it to be a conversation and discussion, because you're generating self-awareness, but also your team or your stakeholders, they have the answers to what good leadership looks like. And therefore, I'd invite you to ask them. That's it from me. I think next slide is just any questions. Tim, back to you to.
Great. Rod, thank you very much indeed. Brilliant. There are no questions that have appeared in the chat. So, and I'm also conscious of time. So, is there anyone out there that would like just to throw a question into the mix? Feel free. Just come, either put your hand up or come off mute and chip in. There's a lot of stuff there, Rod. That was great. There was loads. You know, there's. I think probably requires quite a lot of people to take that away and really mull that one over, because there's loads and loads of stuff in there, and it's worth us reflecting on just how good we are at moving ourselves up and down this spectrum. It's definitely worth reflecting on.
Good.
Thank you, Enrique. I'm conscious though of time, so Rod, look, why don't we call it a day there?
Okay.
Unless there's any last 30 seconds for anybody else just to share any thoughts.
Tim, I'm happy to stay on the line for another sort of 10 minutes or so if people want to dial off. If you want to end it, I can stick around. Good.
Well, that's great. So we'll call it a day here. But anyone that does want to stick around will stay online to take any questions that you have. A lot of people coming in saying thank you very much indeed, and thank you for those. So we'll stay online. The only other thing to say is look out for the sessions coming up tomorrow, which is all around assessment with Gail Pritchard and the team, and very much look forward to seeing you there. So for now, goodbye, and Rod and I will stay on the line if anyone's interested. Cheerio.
Thanks.
So anything from anybody? Would anyone like to share any thoughts? We're watching the numbers go down, but of course I don't think it happens instantly.
Hi guys, it's Richard here.
Hello mate, how are you?
Well done, Rob. Yeah, very well. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just sent you a little flurry of WhatsApps, but you'll come to that. You'll come to those later. They'll probably say the same thing. Yeah. I had a curiosity actually. I love the framework. I don't know if you're able to sort of scroll back to the balanced leader spectrums where you've got those sliding scales between. Yeah. So a question I was curious about is so obviously we can frame some 360 feedback questions so that they're oriented towards these competencies, if we call them those. Have you looked yet into, I guess, mapping some psychometric, some existing psychometrics across, or have you created your own questionnaire that leads into almost a self-assessed and indeed a sort of a third-party assessed placement of an individual on these sliding scales?
Not yet, in answer to your question, Richard, but I really, really want to. And I'm just now reminding myself, I think, Tim, you had a conversation with a couple of academics in the States.
Yeah.
I'd love to work with them and go because they could turn around to me and say that this is a load of rubbish, but I'd love to go through that as an exercise and see what we could produce, because I think it would be really helpful.
We have produced for the book a series of sort of self-reflection questions at the end of each of the chapters about each of the spectrum to allow individuals to reflect on their own position on or their own preference on these scales. But I think what's important about the spectrum is that the idea is you should be able to move up and down it. The whole point of the car crash is analogy is, you know, there's a moment for you to be really directive, and there's a moment for you to be very empathetic. And are you getting the right thing in the right time? Because it might be within 5 minutes of one another. How good are you at moving up and down the spectrum? So I think the question, I think the self-reflection questions in the book, which will be out, and anyone who's still dialed in and listening will be out in September around this. Yeah.
So like Richard, the way I kind of think about it is like, if you think about like I don't know, muscular strength, for example, right? You know, if you are born with loads of sort of, you know, type 1, like really powerful muscle twitch fibers, you could be like really strong and really comfortable operating at one end of this spectrum. But I think that through training and development, you can almost get to a point where you can really flex yourself and be capable at sort of both ends. And I think that's what great leadership looks like, actually.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess that's right. So maybe there's like a home base, and then there's the ability to flex. And in fact, I just noticed in the chat, Yves Pascal has said that the Hogan assessments could provide great mapping data to these competencies.
Yeah, yeah.
Which of course is an assessment that we use. Yves, is there anything you'd like to add to your comment in chat?
Yes, definitely. Hi everyone, and thank you, Roderic, for this great presentation. Definitely using the different organ assessment. For example, the first one, you can look at the derailers. If you have derailers in terms of the last one, give me 1 second, I'm going to go back to it. For example, if you are very diligent, you will micromanage, and you will have very difficulties to delegate. Humility, it can be a mix of different scales. Standard and process versus creative and innovative. It's going to go to some HPI assessment like inquiry and your learning style, your level of prudence as well. If you are high prudence, you are going to be very high standard, high process. And it's interesting to look at the scale as well in the HDS imaginatives. So if you are high imaginatives and high learning and high inquiry, you might be, and low prudence, you definitely are top right. So if you mix the different scales, and if you want to contact me, I'm happy to discuss that with you. But I'm using that for my client as well. So if you use the different scales, you are able to get a great view on this and map it quite correctly.
That would be okay. That's really helpful. That's good to know. Yeah, that's really useful to know.
Yeah, I'm in contact with Richard, so you can connect to me with that. And I think we are linked on LinkedIn as well.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else that is still on the call that would like to chip in or ask a question at all? Okay. Well, was that someone there?
No, that was me. Should we? Okay. We can call it a day.
Well, let's call it a day there. It's been Rod. Thank you so much. Yeah, lots to be thinking about. But thank you, Rod. Yves Pascal, thank you very much for those comments, and Richard. So thanks everybody, and see you again tomorrow.
Thanks, Tim. See you tomorrow.
Cheerio. Bye.